Chapter 1, A New World. Okay, well, first off, the Americas were not a new world. This is a place that's been inhabited by people for thousands and thousands of years, indigenous peoples. I refer to them as ancient indigenous peoples. Western scholars tend to or have referred to ancient indigenous peoples as Paleo-Indians. If you ever hear that term, that's referring to the first indigenous peoples of the Americas. And the way that indigenous people lived, or the type of societies that they had at that time, we're talking thousands and thousands of years ago. We'll talk more specifics on the years in just a minute. But people tended to live in what we call bands. And a band could be a small group or a small community of people, about 25 to 50 people. And these bands tended to live nomadic lifestyles, meaning that they went from one place to another, wherever food was available. Hunter-gatherers, basically, they were people that were hunting large game in those early years. We'll talk about some of that in just a minute, the large game, and also doing some gathering as well. Okay. And so the theory about the population of the Americas, or the populating of the Americas, the big one that was used for many, many years is the Bering Land Bridge theory. And so this theory has started off saying that native peoples arrived in the Americas about 3 to 5 thousand years before the arrival of Europeans. But over time, they had to push that date back more and more, to the point it got to be about 13,000 years before the present. And so that's the Bering Land Bridge theory, is basically saying that native peoples came from Asia, parts of Siberia, and traveled over the Bering Land Bridge. All right, and so let's take a look at what that looks like. The Bering Land Bridge is known as Beringia, and it's this piece of land that was exposed between Siberia and Alaska. It was exposed because sea levels had dropped during that time, because we're talking about from about 25,000 years ago. There was an ice age going on, and during the ice age, a lot of the water in the oceans was frozen into ice. And when it was frozen into ice, that decreased the sea levels, went lower. And as the sea levels went lower and lower, there was land that was exposed, right? Because the water receded, and now you could walk on the land that used to be underwater. Okay. And so these light colored portions right here are the land that was exposed as sea levels dropped. And so that created this, what people call a land bridge. It's not really a land bridge, but it's just exposed land. That's what created Beringia, okay, between Siberia and Alaska. And so the theory goes that indigenous peoples from Siberia had crossed over Beringia into Alaska, and then eventually made their way down through the ice sheets into North America, then Central America, then South America. And so that was the Bering Land Bridge theory in a nutshell. But that theory has been debunked over the years very begrudgingly by scholars who wanted to hold on to it for a long time. But it has been debunked by a number of different pieces of evidence that have surfaced or been discovered over the years. One of the most glaring examples of evidence that debunks the theory are the footprints that were found in White Sands, New Mexico. And these footprints show that native peoples had been inhabiting the area since at least 21 to 23,000 years ago, which is much older than the Bering Land Bridge theory would allow, which was 13,000 years ago. And so now scholars are saying more so that native peoples had been here at least probably 30,000 years ago, and could have arrived either over the Bering Land Bridge, which, some may have done that, but then others argue that native peoples may have arrived through boats, right, by the sea, along the coasts, and coming down like the Pacific coast. And so these are some of the theories that are out there. But then, of course, there are oral traditions from Native people themselves, which must be respected and honored. Many that say that Native peoples have always been here on this land since the beginning of time or before the beginning of time. And so you have a number of different stories and theories and about the population of the Americas and when they first arrived or have always been here. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there so you're aware of that. Um, Anyhow, so yes, the first peoples, the ancient indigenous peoples, many survived by hunting large game. You see here we have a picture of a mammoth, woolly mammoth, or mastodon, a couple different species, but these large pachyderm creatures that roamed the Americas, specifically North America, but there were other large megafauna that existed around that time too, such as giant bison, as well as giant sloths, saber-tooth cats. There were all types of, the short-faced bear, the dire wolf, all these huge megafauna, much bigger than their relatives that exist today. And Native people hunted some of these large game, and that's how they survived because, by killing a mammoth, they could provide food for up to a month if you have ways of preserving it, which they did. They could dry the meat, and others might find other ways of preserving it if they lived in colder regions where they could freeze it, such as submerging it in frozen lakes for it to be frozen and then could be taken out later and thawed and used. So people survived in the Americas by hunting this big game for thousands and thousands of years. But in 11,000 BP, which means before the present, so 11,000 years before the present, these megafauna went extinct. And it didn't just all of a sudden happen in 11,000 BP. It was a slow process, a gradual process that happened over hundreds of years, but eventually the big game went extinct. And so when the big game went extinct, scholars call this next period of time the Archaic period, as opposed to the previous period of the ancient indigenous peoples, is what I'm calling it, but they call it the Paleo-Indian period, that early period of hunting big game. Well, when the big game go extinct, now we enter into what scholars call the Archaic period from 10,000 years before the present up to around 4,000 or 3,000 BP. And in this long period, we see the development of distinct cultures based around specific areas because Native people started to change their ways of lives, no longer hunting big game. Now you have Native people hunting more smaller game and also gathering more. So gathering like nuts and seeds and berries, and that's how people are surviving and subsisting is by hunting the smaller game, like deer, for example, and gathering items. Okay, so that goes on, that way of life goes on for several thousand years, the Archaic period. Now we'll begin to take a brief overview of different regions where indigenous people were living and are living. Places like the Pacific Coast, we'll start there and then we'll make our way around what is now the United States. So Pacific Coast cultures. In California, you have a very diverse landscape. If you go throughout California, if you've traveled throughout California, you'll know there's many different landscapes in California. You have the coast, you have various valleys, you have mountains, you have deserts, all these different types of landscapes. And, you have various different cultures of Native people that lived in those landscapes and continue to live in those landscapes. So you have a diversity of cultures. That diversity, part of that diversity comes from the land and the relationship between the peoples and the land. And so they developed unique cultures that is related to the land that they live on. Okay, so you have a great diversity of native cultures in California. Many practiced a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but some also practiced horticulture as well. And so you have a number of different tribes, like over 500 different tribes and bands. Remember, we talked about bands just a minute ago, in California, and over 90 different languages and local dialects spoken in California. So great diversity. California has been a land of diversity long before the arrival of Europeans and other settlers. It's been, just a very diverse land. In some areas of California, people subsisted off of acorns. Acorns were, and for some still are, a major subsistence food item. People lived off of it, just like how, for other cultures in Europe, bread was like something that people subsisted on. They just lived on bread was like a primary food, or beans and rice in other areas. But in California, acorns were that staple food item. And so there's a long process of preparing acorns. You have to leach them, which means take the toxic tannins out of them. And different tribes had different processes for doing this, but oftentimes you basically filter them with water, and then you store them, and they can be stored for a long period of time. And so people would make different items like breads or mush out of the acorns, and that would be a staple food. But then there was also an abundance of food in California with all these different landscapes, especially on the coast. You have seafood as well, deers. There's all kinds of rabbit. There are all kinds of foods that you could hunt as well. So California had an abundance of food. Part of the reason why you see so many different peoples in California able to survive, many living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, because there wasn't a need for agriculture because there was so much food available, the acorns being part of that. And we could take a quick look here. This is just a map that's outlining some of the groups. This is not, all the different bands and tribes that were in California, but many of the major groups in California. And you can see there's a large amount of diversity of Native peoples in California, many different languages spoken. Some languages spoken in California are so different from each other. It's the equivalent of the difference between English and Chinese. So major different languages spoken in California. There's five different language families that were represented in California, and many different you know, subgroups within those five large language families. If we go north a little bit to the Pacific Northwest cultures like Oregon and Washington, you have cultures that are heavily based on fishing. And some cultures in California were also heavily based on fishing as well along the coast. But in the Pacific Northwest, you have a lot of diets based around fish. So if you're located on the coast, you may be hunting larger game, like whales, for example. And then other tribes that are located more inland would be focusing more on salmon, and other fish that would be in the river systems. And so these fish-based diets allowed people to have an abundance of food, and enough time on their hands where they were able to develop other skills such as woodworking skills. And so you have elaborate woodwork being done in the Pacific Northwest cultures. You guys may have heard of like totem poles, other items, boats being crafted, boats that could be used on the rivers, boats that could be used in the ocean, large canoes that could hold a large amount of people that went out on fishing expeditions or maybe traveled to conduct warfare. And so you have structural or hierarchical societies developing in the Pacific Northwest, partly because of the richness of that fish-based diet, because there's such an abundance of fish there. And so you have, like I said, hierarchical cultures developing there, where you have like an elite member of society, members of society that are part of an elite class. Then you have just your regular everyday commoners. And then in some cultures in the Pacific Northwest, there were even enslaved peoples, people that were enslaved, not in the same type of slavery that you would find later on in the American South, but still people that lacked a degree of freedom and were under the control of others. And so part of that wealth, and you also have permanent permanent villages there in the Pacific Northwest, right? Where people, they weren't living a nomadic lifestyle in many of these cultures. They had permanent village sites that they would inhabit. And so, it goes against the idea that all Native people were nomadic. Many had permanent villages here in, Southern California. You had semi-permanent villages, permanent villages, in parts of San Diego. You had semi-permanent villages as people traveled around to different villages depending on the seasons, but those villages would be re-inhabited over time, and it's just a yearly cycle depending on the seasons. In Los Angeles, you had permanent villages that were there all the time, not living a nomadic lifestyle. And in the Pacific Northwest, also, yes, permanent villages. So, just we'll come back to that later as we talk about the mythology around all natives being nomadic peoples. But yes, you had these permanent villages, you had hierarchical societies in the Pacific Northwest, you had this tremendous woodworking skills and seagoing peoples making a living off of catching fish and hunting or yeah, catching fish. So that's just a brief overview. I'm just going to go over the different regions to give a brief overview. We cover this a lot more in our Native American history course, but we're talking about, the early period here and early civilizations in the Americas. So we're definitely going to spend some time here on the indigenous peoples. The next region that we're going to be going to here is the Eastern Woodlands, which is an enormous region. And you can see like these are like the northern eastern woodlands or northeastern woodlands in this kind of greenish color, and in the yellow we have the southeastern woodlands areas. And so you got a number of different indigenous cultures represented in these areas. And so we'll talk a little bit broadly about this enormous region in the eastern part of what is now the United States. Okay, so Eastern Woodlands cultures. You have permanent settlements beginning around 6,000 years before the present. Okay, so 6,000 years ago, you have permanent settlements starting to develop. It's a pretty long time ago. And 4,000 years before the present, you start to see native peoples in that area or parts of the Eastern Woodlands living an agricultural lifestyle, or at least a partially agricultural lifestyle that was supplemented with hunting and gathering. Okay. And so you might be thinking to yourself, okay, agricultural lifestyle, all right, 4,000 years ago in the Eastern Woodlands, what are they growing? Well, they were growing sunflower seeds and a number of other different local foods, local plants that they were growing there in that area to subsist on and or to supplement their diet as they still continue to hunt and gather. But they also, through trade, got corn and different types of gourds and pumpkins and squash and beans through trade with indigenous peoples from Mexico, okay, what is now Mexico. Okay, pottery as well through this trade made its way. And so, with pottery in particular, you see pottery developing, particularly within cultures where you have permanent settlements, because carrying around heavy pots full of stuff is not ideal if you're living a nomadic lifestyle. But as people did start to live in permanent villages or semi-permanent villages, then you start to see the use of pottery, right? And trade with Mexico helped to facilitate uh, the extension of pottery into the eastern woodlands. Okay, so yes, trade with indigenous peoples from Mexico led to corn and beans and squash in the eastern woodlands, and you have a number of people living either an agricultural lifestyle or a partial agricultural lifestyle there in the eastern woodlands. Over time, as we start to get more towards the modern period, you start to see the development of leagues and confederations. Okay, what is a league and confederation? Basically, it's where you have a number of different tribes banding together or coming together to form a larger political body or structure. And so these could be your leagues, like the so-called Iroquois League, or what they're actually called the Haudenosaunee, or so the people of the Longhouse. And we'll talk more about the Haudenosaunee later on in the course. But the Haudenosaunee, for example, are a large group or league that was comprised of several different tribes, such as the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Onondaga, and later on a sixth tribe as well, the Tuscarora. And so you have a number of different tribes that joined the Haudenosaunee, and there's a whole origin story behind their formation of this league. But ultimately, it made them a stronger, more unified, powerful political body, right? And they had a whole political organization. They influenced the U.S. Constitution even. And so we'll talk a lot more about the Haudenosaunee in future lectures. But you have a number of other leagues and confederations as well as we start to get towards the southern part or the southeastern portion of the Eastern Woodlands. You have other confederations that came together, such as the Choctaw Confederation, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, many others as well. Several others at least as well. So these are larger groups comprised of several different tribes, several different villages that come together that strengthen themselves by coming together as one unit. But oftentimes, even though they came together as one unit, there was still a lot of local autonomy, meaning a lot of power locally within the village, which is where the prime source of political power was local power within the village and not at this larger level. But the larger level was there for other situations such as going to war. Then you have a larger political organization that could help organize the people in case of war or make the decision on whether to go to war or not, for example. So brief overview of the Eastern Woodlands culture. We're actually going to delve a little bit deeper into the Eastern Woodlands because we have to talk about the mound builders. Okay. The mound builders, we're talking about various different native cultures that built large earthen mounds and for various different purposes. And we'll go ahead and jump in and talk about them as well. First, you have the Dana culture. I wouldn't actually even say first because there were mound builders in what is now today Louisiana even before this as well. Going back many, many thousands of years, people building these large mounds that were a part of their settlements. But for now, let's go ahead and start off with the Dana culture. It was not their actual indigenous name. That's not what they called themselves. They didn't call themselves the Adena, but these are names that were prescribed by scholars to these cultures because they didn't actually know their original name. And so, anyhow, the Adena culture develops around 2,500 years before the present and goes on for about 400 years until 21 BP. As I said, the Adena culture known for building these large mounds, some of them large conical shaped mounds like this, like a cone. And the purpose of these mounds was for burial. And so you had individuals, sometimes one, sometimes several, multiple individuals buried within these mounds. So it's kind of a unique aspect of culture there in that region. You don't see much of that elsewhere in the Americas, except for when you start to get to like Central America. So some people wondered, okay, are these mounds influenced from that trade or the interactions with indigenous peoples from Mexico? That's something that's been put out there by scholars. So anyhow, you have the Adena building these large mounds, some of them conical shaped like this one that we're looking at here. And yes, there were individuals buried in them and scholars trying to figure out who these individuals were. Were they, obviously they must have been respected individuals in that society. Were they great chiefs or political leaders? That's something that is still being theorized by scholars. And let me just show you this map as well to kind of give you an idea of where the Adena culture was. So if you look at here, this green portion here, we're still in the Eastern Woodlands. In the Eastern Woodlands, you have this green area. This is around the Ohio River. It's around modern day Ohio right there. And this is where you see the Adena culture and some of the mounds that they built, these burial mounds. And inside these burial mounds, it's not just people, but also sacred items that were buried with those individuals. And so these sacred items, archaeologists refer to them as grave goods. And so, you have various different things, arrowheads, for example, stone pipes that were buried with those individuals. Go ahead and go back here real quick. Stone pipes that were buried with these individuals. Um, uh, Different characters that were made out of sheets of mica as a mineral. And so you had like human figures, animal figures that were crafted out of these sheets of mica, this mineral, that were also buried in some of these burial mounds during the Adena period. As you start to see the Adena culture go into decline around 21 BP, you see the rise of another culture in the same area, but covers a lot more ground, and that's known as the Hopewell culture. Scholars call it the Hopewell culture. Again, it's not their real indigenous name. That's still unknown. And so around 2100 BP, you have the rise of the Hopewell culture, which lasts all the way into the Common Era, 400 in the Common Era. And so with the Hopewell culture, it's similar to the Adena culture. They have burial mounds as well, but their mounds are much larger. And so you start to see larger mounds, and you also start to see the influence of the Hopewell culture extending much farther than the previous Adena culture. So if we go back to our map here, the green area was the Adena culture, right? Their area of influence and where they built some of their mounds. But then you start to see the influence of the later Hopewell culture, which is kind of like possibly an extension of the Adena culture. And this culture has much more broader influence. If you look at this orange area, this is the influence of the Hopewell culture. Not to say that the Hopewell people were all throughout this area, but no, but they had influence. They traded. This was their trade network. They traded with various different peoples that lived in these regions. And so a lot of different trade items that you find going all the way as far west as like Wyoming and as far south as parts of Florida. Okay, all around the Mississippi River, parts of the Missouri River, and the Ohio River. So this is the vast influence and the vast trade network of the Hopewell culture, which also built mounds. And if we go to the slide here, you can see an example of some of the mounds that were made by the Hopewell culture. And they varied in different shapes and types. Some of them were conical, some of them were large, some of them were in the shape of animals. And so huge, massive earthworks that were made by the Hopewell culture and this vast trade network. So interconnected different societies that were interconnected during the Hopewell culture. Eventually, the Hopewell culture goes into decline as well, and we don't know exactly why it went into decline. Some scholars suggest that maybe it was the spread of of bows and arrows and smaller agricultural communities that became more self-sufficient, and so they may have broken off ties with the larger network or broken ties with the Hopewell culture. So you start to see more independence among smaller groups and smaller villages as we start to get to the year 400 CE, the Common Era. But about 400 years later, you start to see the development of more mound building cultures in the area around the Mississippi River. Okay. So by 800 CE in the Common Era, you start to see the development of what's known as the Mississippian culture. Okay. And this goes on all the way to around the year 1500 in the Common Era. And so, one of the big examples of Mississippian culture, the largest settlement is Cahokia. Cahokia. And in Cahokia, you again see these large mounds. But with the case of the Mississippian culture, not all the mounds were used for burial. Some of the mounds had other purposes, such as for ceremony. And so let me go ahead and scroll down here and just kind of show you the influence. This is kind of the sphere of influence of the Mississippian culture. Again, similar to what was with the Hopewell culture, only you see them extending farther to the south in Florida as well. But this is the large trade network of the Mississippian cultures, and there were mound building sites not just around the Mississippi River, but in other parts of the southeast as well. Okay, a little over here as well, at the west of the Mississippi. Um, Remember, I was saying the largest of the Mississippian sites was Cahokia. This is the largest mound in Cahokia. And if we go back to this map really quick, sorry, let me show you where Cahokia is. This is Cahokia up here. This is around like modern day St. Louis, around there, East St. Louis. But here is the large monk, what they call it, Monk's Mound here in Cahokia. You can see it's not a conical mound. This is a large platform mound that has stairs going up here. Um, at the top of this mound was a large, um, well, I'd say a medium-sized structure, and in that structure most likely lived a political leader. And there were ceremonies that were also conducted on top of Monk's Mound, as well as other mounds that were located in Cahokia. And so these mounds served other purposes, not just burial, but also places of ceremony. Okay, and there were also large plazas, like large open spaces at the bottom of these mounds or different parts of Cahokia, and those would also be gathering spaces in these large plazas where people would come together for various purposes, such as for ceremony. Here's another aspect of Cahokia as well. This is an artist rendition, but you can see the large pyramid. Pyramid. I was going to say pyramid. Well, they're large pyramid-like structures, right? These are large earthen mounds that are very similar to what you would find with the some of the pyramids that you would see farther south in parts of what is today Mexico. And again, there's likely an influence there with the cultural exchanges that happened, cultural encounters that happened between peoples from Mexico and peoples of the Eastern Woodlands. But okay, so yeah, you see the large, and this is like an artist rendition, the large mound, and also the an artist rendition of what the structure may have looked like on top of the mound, where the political leadership lived and ceremonies were ceremonies happen. So, but then another aspect of Cahokia as well is this: these are large wooden poles, and modern day scholars refer to this as Woodhenge, kind of referencing Stonehenge in England. But this is another area where ceremony would take place, and it's also believed that these wooden poles were also put there for celestial observations, right? So trying to mark the summer solstice, the winter solstice, right? Looking for, trying to basically keep a calendar because Cahokia, as many other mound building sites, they were agricultural centers, right? So they had large populations that lived there. So let's go ahead and go back up here to our slide. So, yeah, they lived an agricultural way of life. I mean, that's how you had such a large population at Cahokia, and it's believed that there could have been up to 80,000 people living in Cahokia, and that's a large population. And so, usually you don't see large populations like that living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They need a more consistent food source. And in the case of Cahokia and other Mississippian sites, that food source was various different agricultural products, with the main product being corn or maize, right? And so there were farmers, skilled farmers that had huge fields, massive fields of corn, and that's pretty much the subsistence, the staple food that allowed for this large population at Cahokia and other Mississippian sites, similar as well, but not as large as Cahokia. And we already talked about the wood henges, right, with their ceremonial purposes and viewing the stars and looking for celestial signs to help with the calendar for planting and other ceremonial purposes. Okay, so we talked about the Eastern Woodlands, we talked about the mound building cultures in the Eastern Woodlands. Now let's go ahead and move on to the Great Plains cultures. You have a number of different cultures in the Great Plains. We won't talk about all of the different specific cultures, but we'll just kind of take a look at their lifestyle. You have a lot of hunting and gathering taking place, that type of lifestyle in the Great Plains. And this is the Great Plains is, what a lot of people think of when they think of Native American cultures, but just because of Hollywood and movies out there that publicized it. But this is where you have large herds of bison, right? Large herds of bison or buffalo in the Great Plains. And so a lot of tribes that lived there hunted bison before the arrival of the horse. there were different ways of killing, or hunting bison. Typically, stereotypically, you see, native people on horses hunting bison, but that, didn't happen until the arrival of the horse. Spanish horses really were the first. And so before the arrival of the horse, people were hunting bison on foot, and they were using spears primarily to hunt bison. And one of the techniques that they used would be to scare a large herd of bison, like corral them and scare them all into running off of a cliff. So basically, like, you'd have several different hunters surrounding the bison and then making noise and scaring them and like driving them basically on foot, driving them towards the edge of a cliff. And then the bison being in such a frenzy and scared that they, just would jump off of this cliff and fall to their deaths. And that's how you could be able to kill a large amount of bison. Then you go down and harvest the meat, dry the meat, and you have food for a long period of time. So there's a number of these kill sites that have been found in parts of the Great Plains where bison was the staple food for a lot of people. Eventually, though, you have the technology of bows and arrows making their way into the Great Plains around the year 500 CE. And with bows and arrows, it's a lot safer and a lot more efficient when you're hunting bison. You don't have to get as close to them. Say, like, if you're not running them off a cliff, if you're, hunting them on foot and approaching a bison with a spear, that is pretty dangerous. You could lose your life. Bison very strong and they're not afraid to attack a human being. Maybe you've seen that on the news recently, or maybe some years ago, where people, approach bison and are attacked, and the bison very powerful. They can fling them up in the air with just one little movement of their head. And so it's very dangerous. But with the arrival of bows and arrows in 500 CE, it becomes a little bit safer because you could be at a farther distance from the bison and you could shoot multiple arrows at the bison. And making an arrowhead for, bows and arrows is it's not as difficult and not as like painstaking as it is making a spearhead. And you see, I have a little example of a spearhead down here. So like if you lose that spearhead and it took you a really long time to make it, and you say you kill a bison, you try to kill a bison and something happens, you lose your spearhead. If it gets broken or destroyed, it's going to take you a long time to make another one, right? But with arrowheads, it's easier. It's much smaller. You can make a lot more of them a lot quicker, and so and it's just less time intensive, and you're able to shoot from a farther distance, so it's safer for you as well. You don't have to worry about getting attacked. And so with the advent of bows and arrows, that technology coming in from the north, Canada, making its way down to the Great Plains, you see a lot more efficient use, or it's just a more efficient weapon to use, or hunting tool to use when you're out hunting bison. But it wasn't just people living a nomadic lifestyle following the bison in the Great Plains. Many did, but not everybody. There were also permanent settlements, permanent villages in the Great Plains as well, agricultural villages, right? So it wasn't all about hunting bison. Some peoples specialized in agriculture. And so some examples of this, if we look at this map here, you can see the Hidatsa, the Mandan, Rikara, very well known for having permanent villages and growing agricultural products like corn, bean, and squash, for example, pumpkins, gourds. And so, the Pawnee down here in the Central Plains also having agriculture as well. But they also would hunt as well, right? So it's kind of a mixture of hunting, growing crops, gathering goods, gathering plant foods or medicines. And that's how people lived. That's how they subsisted. Okay. But you can see this is a large area of the Great Plains. You have the northern Great Plains up here, and then the more southern Great Plains going down all the way into Texas. Okay. Next, we're going to move over to the Southwest. In the Southwest, we're going to be looking at three different cultures. Going to be looking at the ancestral Pueblo, the Hohokam, and the Mogollon. So let's go ahead and get started. Southwest cultures. And so in the Southwest, you have agricultural settlements developing as well. And if you've ever been to New Mexico or Arizona, you know that the area is a little dry, right? Some places very dry and extremely arid. And there were periods of time where it was like that in the past, but then there was also some periods where you would get these summer rains, which would allow for enough water to have small agricultural settlements and sometimes large agricultural settlements there in the Southwest. So going back to the year 200 of the Common Era, all the way to the year 900 of the Common Era, we see a thriving culture known as the Mogollon culture. And again, this is a name, given by archaeologists to this culture. It's not their actual indigenous name. The Mogollon culture is predominant in what is now today the state of New Mexico, but in that area. Again, it's a hot area, even at that time. Very dry and arid, but there was enough rainfall to allow for agriculture. And they lived in small agricultural villages. And their housing a little bit different than what you see in other areas around North America. They lived in what is called pit houses. And so if we look at this picture here on the lower right, this is an example of a pit house or a partially constructed pit house. So it's called a pit house because the bottom part is dug into the ground about 2 feet, 1 to 2 feet, and then it's covered. It has like a structure, like an outer structure of these large poles, wooden poles. And then that's covered usually with branches, and sometimes it's even covered with mud on the outside of it. And you see there's a hole here on top. There would be, a ladder going down there, and you could come in that way. But oftentimes there was actually an entrance, like a dugout entrance, that you can't see it here, on the outside where you could crawl in. And this hole on the top, more so used for like a smoke hole. So if you have a fire inside at nighttime, could get cold in some of these areas. But the pit house is an ingenious structure for a home if you're living in a hot area like in New Mexico and Arizona. Because it allows for protection from the heat when there's, of course, no air conditioners back then. So if you want protection from the heat, this is a perfect structure for that. It keeps you relatively cool in the summer times and warm in the winter times when it can actually get cold in some of those areas. And so the Mogollon culture, as I said, they lived in these small villages, usually small villages with several pit houses in them. Sometimes they'd have larger pit house structures where ceremonies would take place in some of the larger villages for the Mogollon. But around 900 CE, you start to see the Mogollon culture change and alter, and some say fuse with another culture that we're going to talk about here, the ancestral Pueblo culture, which we'll get to in just a minute. But another culture that we want to talk about before we get to the ancestral Pueblo is the Hohokam culture. The Hohokam culture developed in areas in southern Arizona, what is today southern Arizona. So around places like modern day Phoenix and Tucson, those are the areas where you see the Hohokam culture starting to develop. And one of the key aspects of the Hohokam culture is their irrigation networks. And so if we take a little view here of their irrigation networks. You have these massive, large irrigation networks. All these lines right here represent the irrigation networks where you would have, the river being irrigated and put into the various different fields that they were growing, where they were growing food. And this allowed for large, permanent villages where people would be able to survive off of the food that they were growing. Okay. So like this, for example, is off of the Salt River, the Gila River as well. You have these large irrigation networks. Okay. Very ingeniously built. I mean, they weren't just like, digging out random tunnels and irrigating the waters that are coming from like the Salt River, for example. They were built in such a way where they lasted for hundreds of years, right? It's not, easy. There's a science basically to building irrigation networks like this. You have to have them in an area that's not too much of a slope, but there needs to be somewhat of a slope so that the water will run into your field. But if there's too much of a slope, then the water will rush in too fast and could drown the plants and ruin your crop. So there is a subtle science to this, and that's something that the Hohokam had mastered. So the Hohokam had developed a number of different permanent sites there in the Southwest, permanent villages. And with the Hohokam culture, you see a lot of cultural influence from what is today Mexico, but the indigenous peoples of that area. And so we're talking about large mounds. Yes, so there were platform mounds that were built by the Hohokam, and it's believed that it was through their trade with peoples from Mexico that where they had learned this and they had got that cultural influence. There's also a number of different products that were found, such as different like macaws, for example. These birds, the colorful tropical birds, the macaws. Macaws were found in some of the Hohokam sites. Cacao, which is the beans that you use for making like chocolate. These are all products that are coming from what is today Mexico, and sometimes even the tropical parts, southern parts of what is today Mexico. And so you see these products there in the Hohokam sites, and so that lets modern day scholars know that there was a trade between the peoples of Mexico, some of the peoples of Mexico, and the Hohokam, and this probably led to a lot of cultural influence and the building of these large platform mounds, and also the building of ball courts. If you have ever heard of the ball courts of Mexico, where the ball game was played, the sacred ball game with rubber balls going through the hoops. That game, some scholars believe, was also played in the Hohokam villages, or a version of that game. And it's believed that that cultural influence came from peoples of Mexico. Some may have even migrated from Mexico and lived amongst the Hohokam peoples, and maybe may have been where some of that influence came from. But eventually, the Hohokam culture goes into decline around the year 1400 CE, the Common Era, and we don't know exactly why that culture went into decline. But some say maybe it might have been because of their irrigation systems. Maybe over time, there might have been too much salt in the water, and if there's too much salt in the water, then that will suffocate the plants and they won't be able to survive. And so that might have led to smaller crops, and so people had to disperse and live in smaller villages and not in the larger villages where they once were in order to survive. Okay, and then we'll move on next to the ancestral Pueblo culture. Go back to our map really quick just to kind of get a visual of this. So we talked about the Mogollon here in parts of southern New Mexico and parts of northern parts of what is today Mexico. We talked about the Hohokam over here in southern Arizona, and now we're going to move on to the ancestral Pueblo in what today call the Four Corners region. We call it the Four Corners because there's four states, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, that all have this center point where the four corners meet. Anyhow, this is the territory of the ancestral Pueblo. And I'll talk a little bit about some of their settlements and their way of life. So the ancestral Pueblo sometimes they lived in pit houses, but eventually you started to see them living in structures like these multi-storied apartments. At least some peoples, like the elite members of society, may have lived in these multi-storied apartments. Some lived in the side of cliffs, like they had built these multi-storied apartments in the side of cliffs. They're known as cliff dwellings. But one of the largest sites where you see various large houses like this, they call them big houses, these multi-storied apartments. One of the most well-known sites is in a place called Chaco Canyon. in New Mexico. So if we go here to the map, sorry, back to the map, here is Chaco Canyon in eastern New Mexico, and there's several of these big houses, they call them. Big houses are these multi-storied apartments that could have up to 4 or 5 stories and hundreds of rooms, hundreds of different rooms there. And you see several of those big houses in the site of Chaco Canyon. Okay. And within Chaco Canyon, one of those big houses is known as Pueblo Bonito. Okay, so Pueblo Bonito, this is an image of Pueblo Bonito. And so Pueblo Bonito, you have hundreds and hundreds of rooms in this multi-storied apartment style housing. But actually, a lot of the rooms weren't for housing. A lot of the rooms weren't where people lived. There were really small rooms in some cases. In some cases, they were like, rooms that didn't even have doors. There was just like a window type opening. And so scholars surmise that those rooms were used not for people to live in, but for storage, storage of various different items. It could be different trade goods, it could be agricultural products, because the ancestral Pueblo practiced agriculture as well. They had irrigation systems as well, similar to like the Hohokam. And so, that's pretty much how they were able to have large communities. But in those big houses, those multi-story apartments, most scholars believe there wasn't really a large population that lived there. It was usually just the elite members of society, and then a lot of these storage rooms where trade goods were stored, and then later on people would go in and trade those goods. So trade goods could be corn. It could also be like precious stones, like turquoise as well, because there's a large trade in turquoise that was going on, had been going on, for hundreds of years, from the area of this ancestral pueblo all the way down into deep into Mexico, or what is now Mexico. There was a turquoise trade, a massive turquoise trade that was going on. So there was a lot of wealth there. So you have the ancestral Pueblo culture, which was thriving, going all the way from 100 CE all the way up to 1200 CE. And eventually, this culture goes into decline as well. And for this culture, it's most likely drought that led to the decline. With drought, you don't get a lot of rainfall, and if you don't get enough rainfall, you aren't having as much of a crop, so it's going to damage your agricultural production. And so with that, sometimes it's more difficult, when people are going through periods of drought and starvation or not a lot of food, they tend to break away from these larger communities, and political leaders tend to lose their influence, so they're not as influential anymore because people are like, okay, well, I'm going to go off and do my own thing to survive. Me and my family are going to go move over here. So you had migration taking place as people that were living in the area of the ancestral Pueblo migrating to other areas where they could survive during this long period of drought. And so around 1200 CE, you start to see the decline of the ancestral Pueblo culture. Here's some other images um, of like Pueblo Bonito, for example. These large circular areas, these are most likely kivas. Kivas is like an underground pit house where ceremony took place. Some of these are huge, massive kivas where ceremony took place, where you could fit a large amount of people in there in these kivas, these underground kivas. There's no tops to them right now. When this picture is being taken, it's in ruins, but there would have been tops to these, like large wooden poles and branches over them, so they would be covered. Okay. 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 So we took a look at several of the different regions, and some, just a broad overview of the cultures of native peoples that live there. But eventually you're going to have the arrival of Europeans during the age of exploration, when various different European countries were, sending out explorers, or sometimes you have explorers that are being privately bankrolled through different companies or banks. And so, as European peoples start to come to the Americas and start to interact with Native Americans, you have different views. At first, there's a lot of perspective about Native Americans, and a lot of stereotypes. right? So at first, the stereotype, the big stereotype that you had about Native Americans is they call it the noble savage stereotype. And so what does that mean? It means that there were European peoples, as back in Europe that didn't come to the Americas but heard about it and they read about it in books or pamphlets, and they're hearing about these peoples, these in this new land. To them, it's a new land, but they're hearing about these new peoples, and they're hearing about how they are, the way they live, and their behavior. And one of the stereotypes about Native peoples in Europe during the early period of exploration was this noble savage stereotype, where some European people actually I wouldn't say idolized, but looked up to Native Americans in the sense that they seen them as having noble behavior, right? Being very very giving, not lying, living in what they considered to be like a primitive state of like how man naturally should be or was, according to some European thinkers at the time or philosophers at the time. And so you had this kind of like, I guess you could say, what is it called? Romanticization, right? They're romanticizing Native Americans in Europe for amongst some circles of people who are reading about it and learning about Native peoples. So they may romanticize some aspects of Native American culture and behavior, but on the other hand, they're still seeing Native people as being savage or primitive peoples who are living a lifestyle that is beneath the lifestyle of those living in Europe at the time. So this is the stereotype, the noble savage stereotype, right? Where they kind of romanticize some of the aspects of Native Americans, but while still considering them to be savage, primitive peoples. And so that stereotype exists for a period of time, mainly during the early period of exploration and colonization. But then you start to see another stereotype develop as Native peoples start to resist the encroachment on their lands and cultures by European settlers. And this other stereotype is known as the uncivilized barbarian stereotype. And now, with the uncivilized barbarian stereotype, it's like, okay, you don't see so much the romanticization as much of Native American culture and behavior. Instead, it's more, trying to portray Native peoples as being barbaric because they're fighting back or resisting encroachment of colonization. And so you start to see a number of differences being emphasized by European writers who are writing about Native Americans, talking about some of the major differences between Native culture and European culture. And basically, they're looking down upon Native cultures and trying to, still trying to portray Native people as being savage or primitive. So some of the major differences that they would highlight, basically, which led to a large culture clash between the various different cultures of peoples, is such as religion and land rights and gender relations, right? These are some of the major differences that cause this culture clash, and which some European writers use to denigrate Native peoples. And so there's differences in religion, yeah, sure, different ways practiced by Native peoples, but oftentimes you would have European writers portraying Native peoples as worshiping many gods or multiple gods or false gods, and that they needed Christianity and they needed to, basically change their traditional ways in order to become civilized, right? This is one of those ideas of major differences, and it reinforces this uncivilized barbarian stereotype. Okay. And so, but it's not even true. This is the reason why I'm saying it's a stereotype is because for many Native peoples believed in one supreme being, one supreme creator, right? Just like in Christianity, there's a belief in one supreme creator, God. In many different Native cultures and Native religions, there is a belief in one supreme being, right? Now, the differences between Christianity and some native cultures is there's also the belief that everything is alive in nature, like in the world, right? That everything has life to it. Everything has a spirit, if you will. This is known as animism, but that everything's animated with a spirit, right? Everything's alive. So a rock is alive. It's not just an inanimate object. It has life to it. Plants are alive. There's spirit in those plants. right? They're alive. That's why eating them gives us life, right? The animals, of course, have a spirit. They have, a consciousness. They're alive. And so many Native peoples recognized this life and honored it and seen that that life is related to us as living beings as well. And so in that sense, we're all related in a cycle of life. We're all dependent on each other in order to live in this world. And so that's why you see ceremonies for, people that are going out hunting or fishing, and they do ceremonies where they communicate to the spirit of these animals, thanking it, and asking for it to give up its life so that human beings could live, because they're recognizing that interdependent nature of life, right? We all depend on each other for life. So we don't go out and exterminate all the animals and kill off all the animals just for sport. No, we recognize that there's a balance that needs to take place in life. And you have this communication with these animals or with these fish or with these plants, so to let them know that, asking for permission, basically. And so that perspective, that spiritual perspective of how the way reality works, or how the nature of reality is much different than the Christian perspective of that time. And so that's where you start to see these cultural clashes taking place, right? And misinterpretation of native religion, saying that they're worshiping false gods. Okay. Uh, Another big difference, land rights, land rights. And so the concept of private property, native peoples didn't believe in private property and like owning the land. But there were land use rights. Okay, it's where you can use the land for a specific purpose. So, for example, if you have a native culture that does practice agriculture, various different families or clans would have rights to use plots of land. Okay, and you'd use those plots of land for whatever, growing fields of corn or beans or squash or gourds or whatever, right? So you were given the rights to use that land, but you didn't own that land and you couldn't sell that land. You were just given the right to use it, right? As a member of that clan or the member of that family or the member of that community. Hunting grounds, right? Various different peoples had their own hunting grounds, and it was known that those are their hunting grounds, or maybe they shared hunting grounds or had an agreement with other peoples to share those hunting grounds. But it was known that you're using that land for survival. Okay. And the land itself is alive as well, right? Mother Earth is alive as well. It's our mother. It gives us life. We come from it. We live off of it. That's, it's a way of viewing things. It's a world view, if you will. So there's a concept of having the right to use land, right? And those rights are protected, and people care about those, of course, but you don't own the land, right? You don't have the right to own the land. You don't, it's not like your land forever and building up fences and saying, "Hey, don't come on my land. That's my land." I know I mean, but there's the respect, of course, of who gets to use certain parts of land, but you don't outright own that land, and you don't exploit it in that way. And so concepts of private property is another major difference, which leads to conflict between various European peoples and native peoples. And then there's gender relations. Gender relations also very different. For many European cultures, men were supposed to be the ones who were the farmers. Right, that was considered real work, was farming. Hunting and hunting animals is more of like for sport in Europe, in many European cultures, and usually it was like the elite members of society who did that. um but in native cultures, hunting was what men did. That was the role of men in society in some cultures. And some men were involved in agriculture in some cultures, such as in the Southwest. But oftentimes it was actually Native American women who were in charge of agriculture. And so when Europeans saw this, that it was Native women who were responsible for the working of the fields and growing the food, they thought that this was, wrong to them because it wasn't their type of gender relations. And they wanted to enforce their type of gender relations on Native people so that Native people could become quote unquote civilized. And so to them, Native women were being exploited, or they even compared them to being like slaves. And they were saying that the men were lazy, all these stereotypes, right? But it's really just a difference in gender relations. It's different cultural values. Okay. But basically, what I'm saying here is as you have the arrival of Europeans and settlement and colonization, these cultural differences lead to a conflict and they lead to stereotypes about Native Americans being uncivilized. Okay.